In this movie I want to talk just a little bit about working planes and push-pull. This is not a definitive explanation of all of the uses of working planes or push-pull, but it just to break the ice a little bit and explain a couple of the anomalies that you can see and why they occur and how you can get around them. If you only work in 2D and never work in 3D, then you really don't have to watch this movie. And the only thing I would say to you is, well, you can leave this here set to screen plane if you only work in 2D, and you can always have this set to top plan. And if ever any time Vectorworks starts behaving strangely, it's possibly because you're in a top view or other 3D view instead of your top plan view. So if you only work in 2D, just stick with that top plan and have this set to screen plane. Okay, for all the others, let's move on. So I've got a blank file here, and I've torn off a couple of palettes just to make accessing these tools a bit easier. And you can tear off a palette just by grabbing its icon here and putting it up here, and then you can change the view to icons or icons and text, and of course resize it and do whatever you want to do. So that can be handy when you're jumping between different palettes. Okay, so here we are in a top plan view, and I'm going to begin this exercise or this tutorial by just drawing a rectangle and extruding it to say 5 meters. And now I'm going to switch to a right isometric view. Alright, now we looked at this this drop down menu here a little while ago, and let's first of all explain the difference between screen plane and layer plane. With this set to layer plane, it's assumed that the layer that you're on has like a base or ground, and when you have this set to layer plane, any object you draw, any 2D object you draw, is going to be on the ground, as it were, or on the layer plane. So let's give you an example of that. If I take the rectangle tool and draw here, you'll see that these are drawing on the ground. That's in 3D space, and if I rotate this around, you'll see that they're basically sitting flat on the base level of that layer. That's known as the layer plane. Now, if I was to set this back to screen plane and I draw an object, the object is going to be drawn parallel to the screen, and it's never going to move from that position. So this is basically how objects used to behave in older versions of Vectorworks, or all 2D objects, that is. So if I rotate this view around now, you'll see that that rectangle is just sitting there on the screen plane, ignorant of any 3D information that's happening in the drawing. So this drop down menu here determines how new objects will be created. So if you have this set to layer plane, any new 2D object you create will be put on the layer plane. If you have it set to screen plane, then any 2D object that you create will be put on the screen plane. So once you've created, so this is only for new objects that you're going to create. This is a default setting. I'm going to set it back to layer plane. Once you've created an object, how can you change it to the screen plane or to the layer plane? Well, you'll see up in the object info palette here, there's a plane drop down menu here, and we can control whether something's on the layer plane or the screen plane. So if I change this object to layer, you'll see it's going to drop back down onto the layer plane. If I change it back to screen, it's going to come back to where it was originally drawn and stay on the screen. Let's take another one of these objects here. That's on the layer plane. If you recall, if I set it back to screen plane, there it is on the screen plane, and that's where it will stay now, regardless of what I do in my 3D model. So that's the difference between layer plane and screen plane. We might set that back down to the layer plane and do a fit to page. Now, another key thing to know about 2D objects is that regardless of whether they're on the screen plane or the layer plane, the stacking of these objects still applies. And by stacking I mean, let's just set this to a slightly darker color. So if I draw, I'll put this on screen plane. If I draw an object over another object, the most recently drawn object obscures the object below. So if I draw another object on top of this, these objects obscure one another in the order that they were drawn, and you can alter that stacking order by using the modify menu, send to front, send to back, send, these various things. They're also accessible by right clicking on an object, and you'll see here there are the send things here. So if I said send to back, that object will now go behind the other object here. Now, this is important when you start looking at layer plane objects, because this exactly the same thing happens. So if I set this back to layer plane now and I draw over this object, this is the most recently drawn object, and you can see it's partially obscuring that object, and it's not got the full fill that I had expected. Let's give this a darker fill just to emphasize that. You can see that the darkness of this is not the same, and there's a setting that controls this, and it's really needed because you do have to be able to see through objects that are drawn on the layer plane or on other 3D planes. Otherwise it can get very confusing, and let me demonstrate that. Before I do, I'm going to show you where you can control how this happens, and you do this in the view menu under rendering wireframe options. So here you'll see an option that says show fills in planar objects in 3D views. We're in a 3D view, these are planar objects, but set their fill opacity to only 40%. So that's why this is, I can see through this object to the one below. If I crank this up to 100%, then it's going to behave like screen plane objects do, and I'm not going to be able to see through this object onto that object. Alright, so why is that significant? Well, let's take the rectangle tool again, and this time I'm going to set the layer plane to automatic. And when we set it to automatic, if I have any 3D geometry there, like this extrude, Vectorworks is automatically going to recognize the face of the object and allow me to draw on that face. So it's only a temporary layer plane just while, a temporary working plane just while you are drawing the object. So let me begin by drawing a rectangle on here. So I've drawn that rectangle on that face, and now I'm going to spin this object around, and in this view draw another rectangle, this time using the automatic working plane on this face. And because this object is the most recently drawn object, it's going to obscure this one that I drew previously. Let's now spin this back around. So what do you see? The stacking order still applies. So in 3D space, although this rectangle is behind this one, because of the stacking order, it's appearing in front. And if I wanted to send this to the back, I would have to use the send command to send it behind this one here. So that's why we have the option here to have these objects not have their full fill opacity. And if I set that back, then you don't get that overwhelming feeling that something is wrong with the stacking order, because you can still see the objects, but you can see through them and you kind of get the sense of what they're doing. Okay. Now the next thing that can be tricky with screen plane and layer plane objects is when you're using them to add and clip. So here I have a couple of rectangles that were both drawn on the same plane. They're drawn on the layer plane, and you can see here that it says they're on the layer plane. And so that means that if I go to, say, add surface, they're going to combine into a single object. So what would happen if I went to a front view and I selected these two rectangles? Now remember, they're on different planes. And let's try the same thing now. We'll go modify, add surface. Okay, so it's saying the objects being operated on must be in the same plane. So if you get that message, it means that these objects, the objects you're trying to combine, are either on two different 3D planes, or they're perhaps on the screen plane and on a layer plane. But what you must do is to get them onto the same plane before you can perform any add or subtract operations. And you can see up here that the plane is blank, and that means that, well, I can't display the two planes because they've both got different names and there's only one opportunity to display the name, so I'm not going to show anything. So when you see a blank plane drop down here, it means they're on different planes. Now you could set them back to the layer plane, or you could set them to the screen plane. Essentially they're your only options. But you can actually introduce a third option up there by making the working plane permanently on one of these two objects. Now remember, we talked about a moment ago about when you have this selected, it's on automatic. So when you have the automatic working plane selected, when you draw an object and it appears on the face that's indicated in blue, you're only momentarily setting the working plane to that face. And when you finish drawing that object, the working plane stays wherever it was previously set. And I know that the working plane is currently set on the layer plane as a default. So how can I change the working plane? Well, we have a set working plane tool. You can do it that way. So I could come up here and say, okay, this is the plane I want to be the working plane now, or this is the working plane, or the bottom or the top, or whatever. But a slightly easier way to do that is just to double click on one of the objects. And when you double click on an object that's on a plane, the working plane is automatically then set, transferred from wherever it is now to that plane. So you'll see if I double click on this here, the working plane is now aligned with this object. So you'll see if I spin this around, you can see that the working plane indicated by this big transparent rectangle here, that's the working plane, and this object is on that plane. So going back to our dilemma, which was to try and add these two surfaces together, if I now select this surface, you'll see that I have the option now of moving it to the working plane. And if I move it to the working plane, you'll see it's going to jump to the same plane as this. Now it's jumping in relation to how it was drawn originally. So if you do need to add these together, then you're going to have to realign them like this. And once you've got them together, then you'll find that you can do the add surface, or whichever surface command you're using. So backing up a little bit, what other alternatives are there to get these two onto the same plane? Well, I could go to a top plan view and pick up this object and drag it down to that plane. I mean, that's one possibility. I'm going to back up there. Another possibility is to use the align 3D command, and you'll find this under the Modify menu, Align 3D. And if we choose to, these are drawn in the Y plane, so if we choose to align in the Y plane here, and we click OK, you'll see that both of those objects will be aligned. They're currently now both selected, and I should now be able to use Add Surface. I'll do it from the Modify menu so you can see Add Surface, and that's going to work. So it's usually fairly straightforward. You need to be disciplined about where you're drawing objects and what you have this set to, and you need to understand that that things to use Add and Clip Surface, that things need to be on the same plane. One other thing I wanted to mention was that if you double click on an object, as well as setting that as the working plane, that then allows you to modify that object. So that was modifying that polygon. If I double click on this object, then I can modify that, and so on. Okay, so let's now look a little bit at the push-pull aspects of Vectorworks 2012. And here we are back on our simple extrude. Now if you click on one of these, you're going to notice a new option for most of the 2D tools, and that is the push-pull mode. And you'll see it there for all of these 2D tools. And what this push-pull mode, if you have this button clicked, so that would be the button off and that would have it on, it means that when you draw an object, immediately after you draw it, you can then push or pull that object. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to set the layer plane to automatic, and now when I mouse over the top surface of this extrude, it will highlight. I can draw my rectangle, and let's say I can draw it from this corner point here, maybe to the center. Now notice that so I've just drawn the rectangle. When I mouse over the rectangle, it changes to red, and up here it's saying click on highlighted planar profile to push or pull. So this means that if I now click on this, I can immediately pull it up or pull it down. And obviously I can set a distance if I want to. So if I was to pull this up, then I've drawn a rectangle, but immediately I was able to turn it into an extrude. Let's try that on this face. So let's say go from this corner down to here, and put the cursor back over the object I've drawn and click drag, and we can then use the push-pull mode. Now one additional feature which is very powerful is that if we do exactly the same thing, this time, I'll just move this around a little bit. This time I'm going to take the rectangle tool and I'm going to draw exactly the same way from, say, this corner here. Oh, let's just get that automatic working plane happening first. And I'm going to draw it to the center here. Then I'm going to use the push-pull operation, and I'm going to push in here. Now at this point, before I do my second click to complete this operation, if I hold the optional Alt key down, it will subtract that shape from the shape that I drew it on. Let's try that again. So I'll click here to draw the rectangle on this face. Click again to finish the rectangle, then mouse over to pick this object up and drag it out. And just before I do the final click, so I don't need to do this until I do the final click, if I now press the optional Alt key down and do my final click, this object just got added to that object, and you'll see this better if I render this up. So let me demonstrate that with the circle tool. So again, if I draw this here, drag down, and then I press the Option Alt key, it's going to subtract this circle from this object here. And likewise, if I do the same, pick this as the working plane, click, drag this down. Now if I hold the Alt key down, it's going to add this surface onto the other surfaces. And of course the push-pull tool works normally by itself anyway, as it always did. So if I select the push-pull tool, and I can click on a surface and drag it up or drag it down, likewise with this. And there's different modes with the push-pull and so on, but I'm not really wanting to demonstrate that. It's really just the addition of the push-pull option on these 2D tools that I wanted to mention in this movie.